So I decided I would try and do a video response instead of a written response to our discussion one topic this week. I've broken this down into two parts, and I'll try and keep it short. So without further ado, oh boy, most difficult stuff from these four chapters. This is a little hard for me because a lot of this material is second and third time that I've seen it throughout my academic career. That being said, some of the new theories are definitely new from when I first learned about developmental psychology, gosh, at this point, 8 years ago. But one of the ones that was harder for me was evolutionary theory. To kind of give a little background about where I got stuck and what I do understand selective adaptation. I do understand the concept of evolution, that certain genes are selected for because they provide an advantage in an aspect of life. Take sickle cell anemia, in primarily African societies, people grew up in Africa. Malaria was a big problem. Genetically, they developed sickle cells, which do not carry the malaria disease as readily as, say, our normal hemoglobin. As such, in those countries, people with sickle cell anemia tend to live longer lives. Now, in Western cultures, where malaria is not as big of a threat, sickle cell anemia is something that is not advantageous, and as such, people who live longer lives with it tend to have more problems. Looking at evolutionary perspective, this allowed people who lived in malaria-laden countries had a better chance of reproducing before they died. Nowadays, with Western medicine and with modern medicine and Western culture, you don't have that as much. So I do understand that. And I do understand that these genes are passed down to our kids, which are then passed down to their kids, and then it's something that perpetuates and it spreads. Milk, which is the example the book gave, was another great example. I do also understand that psychology is not all nurture. I do understand that there are some building blocks there that we have to possess before we can start looking at how psychology is developed and how our mind is developed. And I do think that people are predispositioned for some things. I do understand that. I do understand that there is a chance that you don't have the gene to produce enough serotonin. As such, you're going to have some other psychological problems because of the lack of serotonin in your brain. But this is where I get stuck a lot, is how much of this is nature versus nurture. One of the big camps of psychology is nurture, 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 nurture. Or at least that's how it was when I, was learning classical psychological theory and my understanding of psychology. And it seems as time goes on, we look to more of the nature side. And that is definitely a little bit new for me and a little hard for me because I just, studying medicine and stuff, it's hard for me to see how much of our world, how much of it we think is nature over this nurture. And that's what I think kind of this evolutionary theory is discussing, is like, this is nature, not nurture. So I get stuck there a little bit. And then I also understand this is just one part of a two-part theory, which is, humanism, which is the nurture, also plays a role in this universal perspective theory. And I love humanism. I love Maslow. I love his hierarchy of needs. I think that it's a very important concept in psychology and in just everyday life for us in general. So to kind of resolve some of this, or at least attempt to resolve some of my issues, I went and looked up some articles. I found an awesome journal article, which was free, titled Childhood Experience, Interpersonal Development, Reproductive Strategy, and Evolutionary Theory on Psychology, and it was written by Jay Belsky, Lawrence Steinberg, and Patricia Draper. It's a very long article, it's a very good article, and it goes into a lot of different factors of parenting and socioeconomic, and they use the term harsh parenting. They have this wonderful flow chart that kind of breaks things down into harsh parenting versus what we consider a good parent or non-harsh parent. And it did provide some insight into these different factors and how it produces, or how it influences our developmental lifespan in terms of sexuality and likelihood of us reproducing and how we're going to develop as parents ourselves. One thing that they discuss is like a tough upbringing predispositions us to be more likely to date, marry, have sexual activity, and engage in risky behaviors such as unprotected sex at a younger age, which then in turn, as they kind of allude, keeps the chain going. Younger parents are more likely to be harsh parents and reflect their harsh parenting that they received. And to me, this seemed very counterintuitive because, from an evolutionary standpoint, to me, it would make more sense that good parents, or parents that were not as harsh, which I use the term good very loosely because I do understand that there are cultural differences in terms of what good and bad and harsh and not harsh are, but it would seem that this less harsh parenting, where kids were fostered to have kids at a later age, more stable life, less sexual activity prior, around the ages of puberty, would be more advantageous. Be more advantageous to be able to raise your child in a very nurturing and loving household, as opposed to some of these harsh households. And like I said, I'm running the risk of becoming very ethnocentric and cultural centric by some of this paper and how I view it, and in my opinion of it. And so I'm very cautious to say some of these things, but that's kind of where I see the clash with this paper and trying to understand this topic is, how much of this is actually culture? And these are the questions I still have. How much of this is us trying to fit developmental psychology into a culture, into a box? Because, we're looking at, what's harsh, what's not harsh, and how that gets transposed into development. And I'd really like to see more research on that and how much of it is culture. I'd like to see some multicultural. I think that a lot of our research and development in terms of upbringing revolves around Western, American, or not American, but Anglo-Saxon and African American upbringings. And I just, from a scientific standpoint, I think that there's a lot of other cultures and aspects that just kind of are not explored, or at least not brought up statistically, and not brought up as much as I feel like they should be, because I think that culture does play a very large part in this. So I'd like to see more about how culture plays into this evolutionary theory, and how you kind of can push that aside to look at just the biological aspect of it. So that's kind of where I struggled a little bit with this chapter, and we'll come back and talk about how what I did find very interesting. Choosing one topic that I found most interesting was difficult. As I discussed in my autobiography, this psychology is very interesting to me. It's what I have a degree in. And so a lot of these concepts, a lot of these theories, a lot of the development interests me a lot. But one thing that I will say was probably the most interesting was childbirth. It's fascinating to me because about 2 months ago, I got to deliver a baby in the back of our ambulance. It was a interesting experience. To give you guys a little bit of background, we picked up a mother in her 30s. She had no prenatal care. She was homeless, living in the greenbelt of West Seattle. And when we got there, the medic said that, hey, she's not going to deliver. Throughout the course of the transport, my partner was in the back with her, and her contractions started going from being about 30 seconds long every 4 to 5 minutes to being 45 seconds long every 3 minutes. Still thinking we had plenty of time. I remember my partner yelling up to me, "We need to stop now." So I got on the radio, I knew what was going on, and by the time I had the lights on, pulled over to the side of the road, ran around back and opened the doors, I'm delivering a baby. And my partner and I both caught this baby, and then we'd never done this before, and it something that as an EMT you learn, but you don't really like practice. I mean, how can you practice for this when it's such a rarity for us? But we delivered this baby. We finished the transport. Got to stay for the placenta being delivered, and the whole thing was just very exciting for me. And some concepts and topics in the chapters that were brought up that I understand are, pregnancy's 38 weeks long in different cultures or different aspects of prenatal care to delivery to types of delivery to postnatal care. And along the way, there's so many problems. There's so many influencing factors. From some European cultures saying, you can have a glass of wine. From other cultures saying, no, that's not okay. And how those factors play in, because not every child is born with fetal alcohol syndrome. Mother can be drunk for the entire pregnancy, and the baby could not be born with fetal alcohol syndrome. It's a low percentage play, but it's possible. In this example that I give for me, this mother had no prenatal care. She didn't even really know when the baby was conceived, and the baby was born at a healthy weight and from outward appearances healthy. But then, as the book discussed, just because they appear healthy doesn't necessarily mean they're going to develop appropriately. And those things, I just find fascinating how there's so many little influences that can affect how we develop as a person. And that's because I find this interesting because of how it applied to my life and how I look at it as, one day I want to have kids. My wife and I have talked about it, and, we're just not quite there in our lives, but when we are, this is to me the building blocks. This is where, your life began. This is where, little things can play a huge impact on how you develop and how you grow up as a person. I'm not all into the biology, nature over nurture is key, but one of the things that's brought up multiple times throughout the book is the epigenetics. How this is bigger than just you blue eyes, blonde hair genes, or in my case brown hair genes, but more than that, it also just it develops you to who you are based upon these building blocks. And you may have the gene to develop something. Another example is my wife. My wife has type 1 diabetes, something that's generally diagnosed when they're kids. My wife was diagnosed when she was 27 years old. And, you look at it as an autoimmune disease that's related to genes, but she's one of 2 people in her family that has it. So you can't say it's all genetics. There's something else going on, and to me, all of that it's just fascinating. And this is something that'll apply to all of our lives. This is something that'll apply to me getting into healthcare. You all when you're trying to have kids. Just even looking back on how you got to where you are, to think about all of the things that went into birth. It's just fascinating. So I hope breaking this up into 3 parts made it a little bit more manageable. I know that I can be a little long-winded, and talking about most difficult and most interesting topics did last me a little bit of time, but I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope that this is something that I get good feedback on, because it's a lot more fun to do videos than it is to write papers. But anyways, just let me know what you think, and I look forward to discussing these topics with you guys.